Okay, rather than going back and forth through chat with pictures and trying to figure out what the hell each of us is talking about, I figured I'd make a quick video. I just got home, and I have the car up in the air because I'm still working on these fenders and flaring the front and rear, but you can see they're coming along. And again, this is like a 2¼ inch flare. These are some fenders that I traded some on my stock subframe for free, so it's pretty fair swap, I'd say. I got the fenders, he got a subframe, and this is where I'm at. They're molded in, they're glued on with adhesive, and then I use kitty hair to blend them in, and then from here I'll probably start working with Bondo because it's just a lot easier to work with, sanding it and whatnot. But the shape is coming out pretty good, and it's a lot of work, but it's coming along. As for the suspension, alright, so I got my YCW coilovers. I've got my taller bump stops or spring supporters because they came with very small, like 1/4 inch bump stops. So that's one thing that you'll note is the nice tall bump stop. And that's like a 3-inch bump stop. I think in the rear is like a 2-inch bump stop, or 80 millimeters versus 60 millimeters in the rear. I know you use metric, and we're standard over here, and it sucks, but metric's way easier to work with. But anyway, all right, so we got a 7-inch spring. This clears, my wheel sits right about here, and as you can see when I put my new wheels on, these monstrous wheels and tires, they just about barely, because they were so, and I'm right on the strut tube as well. You can see where even the rubber was rubbing the strut tube a little bit of the tire, because they're 315s on 10.5-inch wheels. So the wheel has like maybe 2 millimeters of clearance, but the tire bulges past the wheel, so it's kind of rubbing. It's rubbing here and here. Whereas my old setup did not rub at all. I had like 2 or 3 millimeters of clearance here. And I'm sure if I went to like a 295, which I will do after I kill these tires, I won't be rubbing anymore. But what I did in the meantime is I raised my lower spring perch up. So a big advantage of coilovers, you have independent spring and ride height adjustment. From here, this lower adjustment and this lower sleeve, I can move this up or down the strut and change my ride height. It does not affect my bump or droop travel. Like, we're in full droop right now. The wheel is completely relaxed. We're at full droop. This is my full shock strut extension. Changing ride height does not change this. Changing this lower spring perch height will change the preload on the spring. I moved this up 1/4 inch. Now I have a 1/4 inch of preload on my spring. If I measure from the top perch to the lower perch, I'm going to be at 6.75 and not 7 inches. No preload, I'd be 7 inches here, and this would just barely have tension on the spring. And that's all you need, is just to keep this snug. And you could change the way the car handles with preload, but general consensus is that you don't want a lot of preload. You're going to need to use a lot of rebound damping, because now if you preload the crap out of your spring, it's storing energy. Every time it releases, it's releasing with a higher return rate. Even though compression-wise, the spring has the same rate of continued compression, it's going to be rebounding at a higher rate, because, take a spring and compress it in your fingers, it's going to have more return force at a compressed length than if you only compress a little bit and rebound it. But what we were talking about is this lower spring perch. If you don't have adjustment here, independent from here, then yes, changing ride height is gonna, if you only have one adjustment, this spring is attached to this lower sleeve, and there's not two adjustments. Every time you change your ride height, you're gonna be playing with your bump and droop travel, because your spring is either gonna be getting longer or shorter. This distance is gonna change. I don't know how else to phrase that, but I do have independent adjustment. And what I was talking about with ride height is that I can't really move to a stiffer spring to get my car to sit higher. I'm maxed out here. I can't go any lower on this perch. This perch is on its very last thread, pretty much. If I increase my spring rate to get my car to sit higher, meaning the 700 pounds of unsprung mass, the chassis, this is unsprung mass, your wheel, your brakes, your rotors, your spindle, and we can measure all that out. I need to update my spreadsheet with actual numbers. But unsprung mass, sprung mass, everything above here, everything the spring is supporting, it's roughly about 700 pounds per corner. we have a spring that's effective. It's a 336 pound per inch spring. It's effective as about 310 pounds per inch. So 700 divided by 300, you get like 2.5 inches or 2.3 or so inches of spring compression when just by putting the car down on the springs. If I preload the spring 1 inch, I'll have 300 pounds per inch. I'll have 300 pounds of preload on the spring. When I drop my car down on the spring, since it's already been compressed 1 inch, the first 300 pounds of the car that sits on it are going to do nothing. The spring is not going to move. And then as I lower the car more and more and more, and as the spring starts carrying 500, 600, 700, then it will start compressing at the exact same rate that it was before the preload, the same 300 pounds per inch. The rate of the spring doesn't change with preload, but the amount of weight you have to put on the spring before it starts moving does. So 700 minus 300, I'll have to put another 400 pounds. If I preload this 1 inch, and then I put the weight of the car on it, the spring will now compress another 400 pounds worth of compression, or roughly 1.25 inch. I'm just guesstimating off the top of my head, maybe 1.5. I don't know. I'm just guessing. But what is 400 pounds of car divided by 300 pound per inch spring rate? A little over 1 inch. So I'll be preloading it 1 inch, and then stands to reason it'll be about 1.3 to 1.5 inches, because I know my total compression based on my spreadsheet is about 2.3 to 2.5. So a little over 1 inch. It'll compress a little over 1 inch more. That means that your ride height is going to change when you add preload. I kind of just was rambling there, so I don't know if I covered everything, but you can play around. If you do have independent adjustment, I know that this is true because I've done this. I've put a crap ton of preload on here. When I ran 4K springs, which were like 224 pounds per inch, in a 7-inch length, I tried that first because I wanted to stay fairly soft because it was a street car. I was daily driving it. It did not work because the spring did not have the stroke, and I would bind the spring before I used all my strut travel. And that may not even happen now because I have this taller bump stop in, but I moved from the 4K spring to the 6K spring, and this spring has just enough stroke, I think a little over 4 inches, to cover my whole strut travel. Less, the bump stop eats up some. I have 5.5 inches of strut travel, but this total compressed length of this bump stop is like 1.25 inches maybe. So I don't really have 5.5. I have 4.25 or whatever. Actual travel. So this spring works. It doesn't bind. You don't see any evidence of bind on the coils. And when I did use the 4K spring, my car sat over 1 inch lower. And as you already know, it's pretty low at like, and this is, I'll go to the ground clearance since we were talking about that earlier too. When I give people my ride height, I'm giving them a measurement from the ground to right below this. I don't know if you can see that. Giving them a measurement right to here, right next to the, that's the jack pad, but I'm measuring more as close to the front of the car as possible because this is still flat right here, a flat point to measure from. And you obviously don't want to measure from the center of the car what your ride height is. If there's rake, you want to be as close to the front as possible. And I think the side skirt's fairly flat across the bottom of it, so that's a good level plane to get your rake from. And from measuring from here to the ground and in the rear, from the rear skirt to the ground, I've got about 3/8 inch of rake. And my car sits about, what did I say? I forget. I have it all written down on a pad over in the other side of the garage. But what did I say? 4.5 inches or 5.25 inches? I don't even remember. Off the ground when the car's down on the springs, obviously. So with the 4K spring, I was at like 3.75 inches or something silly like that. The car was low. The front wheels were tucked. The rear wheels were like crazy tucked. Now my front perch, my front fender sits about 1/2 inch above the wheel, maybe more. But yeah, 4K spring. I did not have enough ride height. I didn't like how slammed it looked. I preloaded the crap out of the spring, which ate up its travel. It was always binding. It was a very harsh ride. Every little bump, it was banging off the spring. Bang, bang. But yeah, preloaded the spring. That raised my ride height. Not enough, but yes, preload raised my ride height. What I was talking about doing was now, since I don't want to run stiffer springs to get more height, I was going to increase the stack height of my camber plate, which is integrated. What I did was, previously I had put washers between the camber plate and this stud. I had dropped washers down on the stud before inserting it up through the strut tower, and that spaced out the chassis. I think I'd added a 1/4 inch of ride height when I had the 4K spring. I took those out because the 6K spring, it sat pretty damn good. It's not stock ride height. It's like an inch lower than stock, but it's not terribly low. But I do want to get like another 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch of ride height. So I either need to make a new bottom mount, which I've contacted YCW about, and they're sending me M3 mounts because I'm changing my spindles over to M3, but they're making, I don't think I'm going to get new mounts made up. What I'm probably going to do is, you can make some kind of spacer for here so that this sits higher in the spindle, but then you're losing contact area on, clamping on the strut tube. And it barely sticks out the bottom of the spindle, maybe like 1/8 of an inch. So you don't really want to do that. See if I could get it on camera. The strut tube, yeah, I'm in a suit. I don't want to get dirty, but the strut tube barely sticks out the bottom of the spindle, so you don't want to raise that up. You would have to make this bottom mount longer, and then the car would sit higher. Or what I'm going to do, I don't want to add preload. Preload will raise my, increase my bump travel, and I like where I'm at right now. I'm pretty close to 50-50 bump and droop distribution. I kind of want to stay there. I really like the way the car handled last year, so I'm probably going to go back to adding a spacer up in here, either between here, this, and you can see there's very little stack height with these YCW struts. They have this integrated camber plate, which attaches to this very thin plate at the top of the strut. This is a pillow ball mount. It's spherical, allows for everything to rotate when you turn the wheel. But if I can make this camber plate thicker, or effectively thicker, even space it out between here or space out between the studs at the top again, I can raise the car's ride height. I don't know how legal it is in every class, but that's what I'm going to probably do to get another 1/4 inch or so out of the car without messing with my springs, sending the struts out for revalving, even though they're about 3 years old now and they need it. But that'll probably be my solution to that. All right. I'm going to go back inside because it's freezing, but if there's anything else, I guess, just let me know. All right, bye.